Warm welcome to everyone. I'm proud to be here and would like to say thanks for inviting me and for the great hospitality I have here all the time. So, what we're speaking about today is eccentric strength training with supramaximal loads. Let's go first to the term eccentric. What do we mean by eccentric muscle actions? Muscle action and not contraction, because in a contraction the muscle at the end, at the beginning, goes to the center, but eccentric, it goes out of the center. That means eccentric, and from these eccentric types, we have some different ones. If you look on a biceps muscle, and I bring this bottle of water down on the table, I work eccentrically. So the muscle lengthens. This is a submaximal eccentric. And the submaximal eccentric in exercises almost plays no role. The effects are lower than in a normal concentric movement. So where we are interested in is supramaximal eccentric, and that means if I would try to hold the bottle in that position, but the bottle is extremely high in the load, I try to resist, but I cannot do this, so the forces coming from outside are stronger, so my muscle is stretched against the contraction I produce. And these supramaximal contractions can occur as a purely eccentric muscle action or in combination with eccentric plus immediately concentric afterwards, what we call then a stretch shortening cycle, or plyometric, or reactive. And just a short review to this supramaximal eccentric. We started in the 70s and could show that if you use high loads with explosive type of contraction, you had a nice increase in rate of force development and in maximal strength level. You cannot do this when you are fatigued, but the reason for that is the high loads make a nice adaptation of the intramuscular coordination of your nervous system. So the idea was, if we use higher loads than explosive concentric one, and we normally use 3 sets with 3 reps, so these were 3 times a max contraction with a 1, or in that case 3 repetition maximums. We thought, is there any possibility to give to your body higher loads? And this was the eccentric situation. So we had 3 different types. We had a leg press, and we had an overload on the leg press. So we had both legs with a single repetition max, and then when we not fully extended position in the knee, we brought one leg away. So the overload presses you down in the starting position, and you try to resist as hard as possible. The other possibility we did for the arms, where you were in an upright standing position, you had the arms extended, and then you fall down on the ground. The interesting point was, when we did this, we had nice results in increase in maximal strength level. We had small results in better rate of force development for the concentric movement in testing. And with the following experiments, the effects were much smaller. But what we could find was a much, much better strength endurance. But we were not intended to do that, because we had 10 times falling, and that's it. So I never published this because I couldn't explain it. And nowadays I know what happens. With these fast stretches of the eccentric type, you have a very nice adaptation of the connective tissue. And if you do repeated movements and you had a stiffer connective tissue, you get better results. So the sum of impulses you produce are better. Now, let's look to the influencing factors of force production in eccentric muscle actions. That what we know today is it depends on your muscle mass, it depends on your muscle fiber composition. Muscle fiber composition plays an important role because when you fall down on the ground and you stretch your muscle, you get an 1A afferent volley from your muscle spindle. And this is a monosynaptic connection to the big motor neurons of the motor neuron pool of the muscle from which your spindle is firing. And that means that, different to the Henneman principle, where the small motor units start the contraction, and at the end, if you have a load of more than 90%, your fast twitch motor units are firing. In that case, in an eccentric phase, your fast twitch motor units are activated first. Makes a sense, because you think when you need that under conditions, I think that you are not doing any type of exercise, or you have not integrated the whole system in a training, but then you're walking or running, you're stumbling, you fall down on the ground, and then you get a stretch on the extensor muscle, and you want to avoid injuries on the head. So from physiology, it's quite clear what happens in that situation. And then you had these parallel elastic components I mentioned before, when you had these falling experiments and you had an improvement there. And then you have a short-range elastic stiffness. This short-range elastic stiffness is when you go for a contractions, you have the binding of the proteins of the filaments inside the muscle. And when you begin with stretch, these cross bridges are holding for roughly 4% of the muscle length and for a short time span. So you have to overcome the time after touchdown until your reflex answer occurs and continues with the contraction. And then the innervation characteristics I mentioned. And then another point is, when we think, where does these higher forces come from? When you have these eccentric conditions, it could also be that it's just inertia of resisting load for the external conditions. So if you bring a mass down on a platform, you get a higher increase without any contraction. So let's look to the to the single points, and we start very basically with the muscle fiber of a frog. And if you look on the muscle fiber of a frog, you find this hill curve, force velocity curve, and you see that it's for the whole muscle the same. Later on, then we have it here for a single muscle fiber. And if you overcome the 100% load, so the PO, you see with 100% force, then there is again a negative velocity, and you can produce higher forces. So if we now go for a whole muscle, we have the same system. If you see the curves inside here, it's from Paavo Komi from Finland, very early work. And he was looking if the electromyography activation is different in a purely concentric movement, as you had it on the right side, or eccentric, as you can see it on the left side. And it's for the biceps muscle. And we have the integrated EMG on the upper part, and then on the biceps brachii, and on the brachioradialis, and the triceps at the bottom. And of course, the triceps doesn't do so much in that situation, so the flexors are of interest. And from this curve, it was assumed that you don't have higher electrical activity during eccentric work. So the question was then all the time, if you have not higher neuronal input, you just maybe you stress the connective tissue, but this is not a stimulus for the muscle. So that was believed till the middle of the 80s. Maybe there's one small part here. You would say maybe here you have a little bit higher electrical activity. We come to this back later on. And then a very important point, also from the Finnish research group, was when you have an eccentric part and you make a small rest interval in between, and then you go to the concentric part, you have a totally different result than when you do the same without any rest interval in between. It's not that much. What he is, there's only some milliseconds in between, but you see the height of the force production here is less than here. So it's called a coupling time. I'm not really sure if coupling time exists in real situation, because you cannot measure it, for example, in running. And in running, you have these stretch shortening cycles. And compared to the purely concentric on the right side, you see you have indeed higher force production. Now, the inertia is if, for example, a big mass is going down here on the wall and presses the force plate against the subject. In that case, the subject do anything. Even if you not try to resist, you get higher force values. So the critical point then was, what happens if you do experiments, and how could you do that? And if you measure the activity of the muscle, if you can show that the muscle contributes to this higher force production, you can use eccentric actions as a part of your training. So up to that time, we were working with an apparatus like this one. It's like a multi-press, but it's just for a single arm that you can see it's produced only from one arm. And you're working against this bar. You have dumbbells, and you can bring a lot of load. And if you have small loads, you get force time curves like that. If it's that heavy that you cannot move at all, you have an isometric condition. This is the solid line here. And to produce now an eccentric one, we brought an overload on the bar. We levered up the overload by 4 centimeters. Then we asked the subject to do an isometric max contractions, and then we solved the fixation of the overload. And when we do this, we saw that we have a nice increase, which is bigger than isometric max. And isometric max is the highest voluntarily force production you can do against an insurmountable resistance. And that's the definition for maximal strength. And higher strengths, let's see here an eccentric one, now you can produce, and you could look what happens. So if you take EMG additionally, then with the EMG, you measure not only a single EMG, as we had it before in these COMI results, but we used 32 attempts. So we had 32 eccentric force time curves, and we averaged these, and we looked for the average EMG of the same 32 attempts, and then you see that you had it's a rectified averaged EMG, and then you see that you have higher EMG for a short time, some 100 milliseconds, and that's enough to activate your muscle spindle and to bring the process that the 1A efferent volley goes back to your motor neuron pool and produces higher forces. So we were happy with that, because then you say we can use these supramaximal eccentric as a part of our exercises. The COMI group has also worked at the same time, and he showed that the eccentric in any case, you see the upper curve, is higher than the concentric one, but it's also depending on the angle. So if you go for this biceps muscle, it's clear force production in that position is much less than here, and it's again less here. So if you would use the eccentric, you should do this in a situation where you can produce the highest forces, highest forces. And that means for the biceps in a 90-degree position of your ankle. What about the energy expenditure? That's a work from Japan, from Kaneko, and he showed that in a concentric movement, you need much more energy than in an eccentric. This eccentric is not a supramaximal eccentric, it's a submaximal eccentric. But even in a supramaximal, the situation is different. So if you want to focus on the energy expenditure, in that case, you should do a purely concentric movement. Now, there are specific adaptations depending on the contraction type, small or even no transfer. If you have an increase in eccentric strength, have it a positive effect in dynamic situations or in isometric testing conditions. And I just brought some of the works here to this problem. Same problem will comparing concentric and eccentric strength changes. You find a lot, because if you have different muscles, different testing conditions, you could find positive effects, you could find negative effects, and that was the reason why we then were looking and say lengthening the muscle produces in any case higher peak forces compared to isometric or shortening. And then we started with an experiment, and we had 2 investigations. One for the upper extremity, one for the lower extremity. One for untrained people and another one for highly trained, strength-trained people. And the first was, we see here, was for the legs. These were untrained people. I mean, untrained people are physical education students, and they are untrained. I mean, they are 15% better than the average of the same age, but the 15% is nothing compared, let's say, to top athletes. They are around about 70 to 80% better in the strength level. And we had 15 people in the control group, and we had 13 in the control group, 15 in experimental group. The experiment was 6 weeks, and we had 3 workouts per week. And in each training session, we had 5 sets with 3 reps each and 5 minutes interserial rest period. And then that was the training exercise. So it was a leg press, and we looked with an Elgon, how long is he able to resist? And then when he could hold it a little bit and then slows down, that was the value we choose as the Eccentric Max. And when it was going down immediately, it was too hard. In that case, it was an overload, and we didn't take this value. Test was done on a leg press machine, and we measured isometric force, we measured rate of force development, and we measured also concentric single repetition max. You see the force time curve, and we get the position in which you see it, we get the force values and the rate of force development. And we also tested the 1RM, and then we looked what happens with the whole situation. The next what we had were looking if there are any changes in the isoforms of the muscle fibers, especially in the fast ones, and looking with the biopsies. This was done together with the University of Ulm, and we also checked squat and counter movement jump, because we want to look what's the transfer of the improvements we will find in the supramaximal eccentric testing. Is there a chance that you have a transfer to purely concentric jump events, or also counter movement jumps? So you start in an upright position. I think you are familiar with these jumps. It's not necessary to go more in details. Let's go to the results. We see this was the Eccentric Max at the beginning, at the end. So we had an increase of 28% increase, and we had a highly significant result here. The 1RM increases from 97, 122. It was a 30% increase, and this was also significant. But in the isometric force only 5%, and squat jump showed no effect, counter movement showed no effect, and rate of force development showed also no effect. And when we're looking on the fiber types, we see that there was not a shift from 2A to 2X or elsewhere, so it stayed exactly the same. And this is not exactly what we had in the first experiment. I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, because in that case we had a nice transfer, but these people at that time, in the late 70s, were not that strong than this one here. So the next point was then we looked at the load changes within a workout. And you see that from one set, the first to the fifth, it's getting a little bit better because it's like a warm-up. The effect is maybe 2.2%, and that's exactly what you also find in a warm-up procedure. So if you have high-performance athletes and you make a warm-up, in that case, you have an increase of 2.2%, which is for a top athlete okay when you think that you win gold medals with a distance in milliseconds. Then it's okay, but for normal people, I think the effect of warm-up in better improvement is extremely small. So I remember when I was a student, I was a student helper in the Olympics in 1972 at Munich. And in the 100-meter dash, a Russian guy, Valery Bosov, he won the 100-meter gold medal. And 100-meter dash, and I was standing aside this guy. He had a little bit like that, 10 meters running, coming back and said, hey, can you tell me where's the weight room? I said, it's over there here for warm-up. He made deep squats 3 times, 180 kilos. He came out, and then he started. And that's exactly what we found later on in the doctoral thesis. If you make 5 squats, these are too much. So make a small warm-up with 10 or 20 reps and then high loads. Less one, that's enough. Otherwise, you get fatigued from warm-up. But, okay, the load changes over the 6-week period we see here. And this maximum load and the average load. So nicely increase over the whole time in the adaptation. And the same is true for the load changes here. So from training session to training session, I mean, this type of supramaximal actions work fine, except the problem with the transfer. Now, when we go for correlations and say, can we tell, is there any correlation? We have on the first here, the Eccentric Max and the 1RM, and the correlation is fairly low. And the same then is true for isometric max and 1RM and maximal isometric and eccentric. So the best correlation you have, or the best prediction, is the 1 repetition max. So the dynamic situation tells you more than any type of isometric max. We do a lot of isometric max in patients because it goes fast and it's cheap. But concentric one would be much, much better. Now, let's come to the second investigation. In that case, these were not the legs, these were the upper extremities. And for this second one, we used subjects who are experienced in strength training. So the experimental group, again, were 15 male students, and the control group were 10. And the control group were not strength trained. They were normal students. But the experimental group, there was a demand of a single repetition max in a bench press of at least 105 kilos plus. And again, the treatment was the same, 6-week training, 3 training sessions per week, and the training session 5 sets, 3 repetitions, and 5 minutes of interserial rest between this period. things look like that. This was a training exercise. Always 3 people were working together. So the high load was brought in an upright position. The subject was laying and trying to resist when the load was coming down. And the testing was isometric one. So we had the force transducer on the bar. And then we could measure in a 90-degree angle position the rate of force development and the maximal strength. So this is the force time curve. Again, the same situation we had before. You had the max strength, you had the rate of force development, and we repeated this several times. Normally, we need 3 to 5 max contractions, and then we get the best one. And the time between the max contractions were always at least 10 seconds. So to avoid any type of fatigue in between the whole story. And the 1RM, you see a very normal one. We had also an EMG for these guys. I will not focus on this. And the testing was the eccentric strength. So it was the same situation as described before. So we 2 subjects leveled up the load, and we looked what could he resist and how long. And this was controlled by an algon, so that we have exactly the time and the angle which changed during this testing position. For measuring the speed, we use a bar, and along at this side, we had barcodes. You know the barcodes you had on the bottles when you pay, you go to the cash. And these barcodes are white bars and black bars, and it's all the same size. So in that case, you can use this system for measuring the acceleration and the distance. And it's a very cheap system because there are millions of these testing things around over the world. And tested was that the bar was the bar was pushed upwards. See it here? So we were working with the open hand, not with the grip, and then you push the bar as far as possible and as fast as possible. The subjects were control group, age, body weight, and height, and the experimental group, a little bit higher in body weight because these guys were stronger, and but there were no significant differences between those. And if you look for the Eccentric Max, the control group had at the beginning 78.5 kilos, whereas the experimental group in the average had 136. And the single repetition max was 68, which is fairly normal for physical education students. And the experimental group almost 120 in the average. So they were not really poor guys. And the maximal isometric, here and here the maximal isometric. And then rate of force development, also faster. And the stretch shortening. The velocity of the bar, 2.8, 3.2. If we go for the effects, then you see that the eccentric max changes from 17.7. This was a highly significant value. 1 repetition max, no. Isometric force, no. Rate of force development, no. A little bit increase in speed, but not very much. the load changes within, and we had no effects in the control group, so I did not show that. But this is a change now within a workout. Remember, in the weak subjects, we had this warm-up effect. Now, in the highly trained, it's going down. So you produce fatigue much faster from these high loads. And the load changes here again. Nice increase, not that much, of course, because these are trained people. And we had again the mean load and the average load. And the load changes within these 18 sessions. So again, nice increase. That's what we would have expected from the whole story here. But correlations much higher. The best correlation we have here, 1 repetition max, and eccentric, it's over 0.9. That's fairly high. So again, the recommendation would be, if you want to know something about the strength level and you have only a single variable, then take this 1 repetition concentric max. That's what's really the point. And you can work with this much better than with all the other things. And by the way, co-worker of my group showed that if you took the mass by computer tomography of a muscle and you correlate the mass of the muscle with a maximal strength level isometrically, you get 0.6, 0.7 in the correlation. But if you go for a single repetition max, the correlation is over 0.9. So again, this is a nice value and a nice result for detecting the overall strength level. Now, what we saw now from the experiment up to here is that in untrained people, you had an increase in the eccentric maximal strength level, and you had an increase in the single repetition max. None in the rate of force development, and only small transfer. But in the trained people, you have only an increase in the eccentric maximum. That's it. Nothing else. So that's a point where we should look. If you give a recommendation for supramaximal eccentric, you should keep in mind what's the level of this person. When it's high trained and you do this supramaximal eccentric, in that case, you might have a benefit if in the sport or discipline movement you have an eccentric part. If not, it's wasted. It's wasted the time. And another important point is, I didn't mention up to now what happens with all these subjects. Those who were working with the legs had an injury rate of 29%. Those who worked with the arms had an injury rate of 36%. And now remember, if you have an injury rate of around about 30% or plus, the risk for high-performance athletes is much too high to do that. These people are too expensive. So, of course, we know you have a nice increase in strength level. That's for sure. Maybe it's one of the training methods where you have the best benefit in increase of strength. But in a normal subject, you do a strength training not because you want to improve your strength level. You do a strength training because you want to improve in your sport or discipline. So first of all, you need a transfer. A second one, what happens with a delayed onset of muscle soreness? It lasts for 2, 3, or 4 days. So you can't do any type of technical training in between. So sometimes we have methods from which we know, oh, they work fine, you have a good result, and it's a hip. And at the end, when you go and say, okay, but I need it now for sprinting or jumping or game sports or what else, it's quite clear that you destroy the people with that. No? But there's one interesting point. I said that the eccentric maximal level increases. and the isometric stays almost constant. 20 years ago, we were working with explosive concentric maximal contractions. Again, 3 workouts per week, 3 sets, 3 reps per set, and over a time of 8, sometimes 10 weeks. And then we get the result you see here. It was a 6-week training in that case, and it's published in the Comey book, Strength and Power in Sports. And you see here on the here we have the force, and on the abscissa we had the load. So if you work against a given load, you produce higher force than the load, of course, because you want to accelerate it. And the solid points here, the filled points, are the force production after the 6-week of explosive concentric max contractions against the same load. So you can produce against the same load higher forces, so you produce a higher impulse, so you are faster. That's what we know. The interesting point at that time was that we also measured the Eccentric Max with the machine I showed you before, where we had the overload, let them down. And so we had a comparison between the isometric and the eccentric. And we saw that after 6 weeks, the isometric increases, nothing special, but the eccentric stays constant. So this is just the opposite from that what we found with the supramaximal eccentric. In the supramaximal eccentric, you increase the eccentric maximal level. If you do concentric explosive maximal contractions, nothing worked on the eccentric, but your concentric comes closer to the eccentric one. Now, if we think about this story here, you have a nice conclusion. If you know the eccentric maximal value of a muscle group, and you know the isometric max, and you measure the difference, you can easily predict what to do in the future. If the difference is big, in that case, you make a lot of explosive maximal contractions, so your level comes closer to the isometric. If it's the opposite, you have to do something what increases the eccentric strength level, and the eccentric strength level, let's say, is a representative for your muscular potential you have in the moment, for your muscle mass. So now you can easily decide from the difference of these values, should I do anything what works for a hypertrophy? Or should I do something what makes a neural adaptation and brings my activation level closer to this eccentric one? Or with other words, how many % of my strength potentials inside a muscle I can use voluntarily? So we worked on that then for some years, and it's going quite fine for the arms, because the muscle fiber distribution in the arms is mainly fast, and the loads against your work are not that extremely high. If you have the same concept for the legs, it makes a problem, because you need huge machines for that. And the situation we have here then is hypertrophy, of course, that means increase of your eccentric level, can be done by destroying sarcomeres. And destroying sarcomeres can be done either by mechanical stress, that's what you have these high loads, or you jump down, you have landings, the same situation, or you work a long time. And if you work a long time, the weak and old sarcomeres are damaged from the young and better one you have around them. That's the bodybuilding type. So these are the two possibilities you have for increasing eccentric. And for increasing the isometric strength level with a explosive max. In that case, you must be unfatigued, of course, otherwise it doesn't work, because you need high frequency, high recruitment, and high synchronization. So that's let's say a good point how to do the regulation of an exercise. And you can predict what to do. And you can also do a diagnosis when you should stop. Because if the isometric max is coming close to the eccentric, and close means around about 5%, that's it. We find in top athletes differences between isometric and eccentric 3.5, 5%. In untrained people, we find differences of 30 to 40% because they are not able to activate the whole situation. And it's quite clear what to do now. So then, in the meantime, we were thinking about these, let's say, strategies of the body, how to adapt. And you say, okay, what would happen when we make a combination of both? We make high concentric activation, followed by an isometric, and then by a supramaximal eccentric. So what we did, we built a machine. We built a leg press machine. For those who followed the lecture yesterday, I had a picture from that machine. You're sitting and you have pedals. You move forward and backward. And there's a hydraulic system which presses the pedal backward. So you push it actively forward and have a hydraulic system. You have force transducer, you can measure that. So the whole situation is like this. You start in a position like this. And then you push the legs forward. You come to an isometric max. The machine blocks you. Isometric contraction. And then you have a supramaximal eccentric going back in the first position. And then the second contraction, the third, and there is no rest interval in between. You do this exactly 12 times. After 1 minute, it's all over. You have a total depletion of the carbohydrates. And this one, before we started, we were looking about the velocity. You remember there was the picture from Paavo Komi that the velocity and the transition is important. So it's not only the eccentric part, it's the velocity, the stretch velocity, and we know the higher it is, the higher the contribution of your muscle spindle. So I said, okay, let's try it, and we have an eccentric velocity, the stretch velocity of 3 meters per second, 4 meters per second, and 5 meters per second. 3 meters per second I did by myself. 4 and 5, 2 of my doctoral candidates. This was on Tuesday. On Wednesday and on Thursday, these guys were not at the university. And then Friday, they come and I said, oh man. I said, what happens? Wednesday morning, when we try to come out on the bed, we fall down on the knee. And on Thursday, we could use the stairs backwards. So then, okay, we decided to do this with 3 meters per second. And we had one workout per week over 6 weeks. And we had almost no adaptation. Why? We destroy too much material with this high load of the eccentric type, totally depletion. So even after 6 weeks, you had no positive effects, whereas the control group, who just did explosive max contractions of the concentric type, showed the nice increase, what we would have expected. So think about that. When you have supramaximal eccentric, be extremely careful. Maybe you can destroy more than you win with the whole story. And if you bring it inside the complex training, think about the transfer, if yes or no, and think about the other technical element and skills you have to do also besides the strength training. So coming to the recommendations at the end, There are big difficulties between less trained and highly trained people. Think that the injury rate is extremely high. A transfer in concentric work only in less trained people. Not recommended for top athletes because it conflicts with the technical training, and the comparison of maximal isometric and eccentric max level could be a good idea for regulation of training and show you which type of strength training method should be the next. So if you have any question, thanks for your attention. We have 4 more minutes. And if you want to ask something, either on the mic here or then at the end outside of the auditorium, I'll be there for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Hi, Roger Nelson, Tactical Fitness and Performance. I was wondering, after those 6-week blocks of eccentric training, how long did you wait for them to recover before doing the testing?
Normally we have the testing immediately after that, and then 2 weeks and 3 weeks later again, because you had this situation that when you destroy sarcomeres, you need in young people 6 to 8 days for building new sarcomeres, and in older people like me, probably 2 or 3 weeks. And then you have this situation that the best results you get then 2 or 3 weeks after the end of the experiment.
Thank you.
By the way, this is very important also for the cessation of a strength training before the competition. Huh? Well, when we look on the top athletes and we ask them after the Olympics, we had the result from Beijing, we had the result from Turin in the Winter Games, and we had a result from London. And the German national team, they show you in the answer, we had the last strength training workout 3 or 5 days before the competition. What from practical point of view means they are in the best shape when they travel home. But the point is that everyone do it like that, so forget it. It needs around about 20 years to get important results from scientific area to the practical work.
Matt Barr, University of Manitoba. I just had a question. We spent a lot of time talking about periodization models of changing the amount of repetitions we do, maybe leading to like higher repetitions, hypertrophy type work, and then leading into lower repetitions, max strength type work. Is there room for periodization models where you actually move from contraction type, like if you begin with heavy eccentric training before maximal strength training leading to stretch shortening cycle training? Mm-hmm. Is sequencing like that, is it more effective?
That's a difficult question. A co-worker of mine, Dr. Schlumberger, he made experiment with undulating periodization with blocks. We made it with young people, with novices, and we made this with top athletes. In top athletes, you have good results with the undulating periodization, and especially in game sports. And we do this in sports where you have long competition phases, like, for example, in beach volleyball or in the soccer. And in youngsters, the blocks are working better. The point is, if you compare maximal strength level, you don't find significant differences if you have undulating periodization or you have blocks. But what the difference is the gain in speed. And the gain in speed is better in an undulating instead of blocks. And the background for this is probably that you have a higher adaptability of your nervous system. That's what I mentioned yesterday. You need a type of variability in your training to make this nervous system as flexible as possible. In that case, we have recommendations where we have one supramaximal workout in 2 weeks. So we make concentric, max, explosive one, jumps, and sprints, and if it's a power event, and then probably every 2 weeks, one supramaximal eccentric.
So regular exposure to the different types of training is possibly more beneficial then?
I couldn't get the
Sorry,
question.
regular exposure to the different types of training. Like if you use supramaximal eccentric training, or sorry, maximal training, it would be good to regularly expose it to throughout the training, rather than separating it by a long time period. That's why it'd be better.
It depends what you want to have. You can organize it in that way or in the other way. It depends what's your aim, and it depends on which type of sport you need it.
Yeah, so I guess for like speed and jumping and activities like that.
You cannot combine all type of exercises. So these things I showed here, where you need, let's say, best adaptation to power events, you can only combine those methods which are directed, let's say, on the nervous system, or those which are directed on the muscle. You cannot mix them, otherwise you get a negative effect.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. So I think time is over. Questions outside? Okay. Thanks.